Hello watch enthusiasts and welcome to Watch Chronicler Podcast. In today's episode, which is indeed the 7th episode of this podcast, I'd like to speak about what makes a luxury watch today, what did in the past, and I think what will tomorrow. Because the whole concept of luxury which we throw around in the watch industry doesn't really have a particular definition or a meaning. It's defined entirely by what we like, what we find interesting, what we find aspirational. And so I'd like to speak a little bit about this theme because it's one which is very rarely discussed because one has to step back and think about it. So I hope to provide you with an interesting episode today about something a bit different. Before I begin, I would like to remind you that this podcast is available on Spotify as well as on SoundCloud, and also there is the RSS link in the description of this video, as well as in the article and piece on the watchchronicler.com website, where you can also listen to this with the screen off if you so wish. Of course, remember to like, share and subscribe to us on YouTube to catch videos as well as podcasts, and head over to watchchronicler.com where you can see full articles and much more in-depth content than you see here on the channel, which really is just the tip of the iceberg. Also remember that if you enjoy photos of watches and to be really involved with Watch Chronicler, then head over to Instagram. We have a full page with a carefully curated set of photos, as well as news and information about new releases, new articles, as well as new videos and podcasts. Now looking retrospectively, because I think this is important first of all to understand where fashions for luxury watches have come from, we see that at the beginning of wristwatches, really, they weren't luxury watches, that was the very point. At the turn of the 20th century, let's say in 1900, the pocket watch was what a man would have if they wanted something of a luxurious nature. Of course, the movements were incredible. There were minute repeater movements, and an exquisite range of different timers and other options, as well as pieces which won chronometer awards, such as the ones from various shows, various exhibitions, or expositions, which you can still buy today, in fact, often in very good condition because pocket watches just haven't been used so much, where a wristwatch will tend to suffer more abuse over the years, which are marked on the inside of their case, or their hunter case, for example, with the symbol of the exposition they were involved in. But moving forwards into the early 20th century, in the 1920s and 30s, of course prior to that, in the 1910s, we saw models like the Cartier Tank and Cartier Santos in the very early parts of the 20th century. But these were still watches which were, of course, luxurious in terms of their qualities, but they served a very practical function, whether it was for a pilot or something to be a bit more convenient. But nonetheless, there was still a trend of the pocket watch being used. It was only as we moved from the 20s to the 30s that wristwatches really became these luxurious items. And in the 20s, there were remarkable watches being produced, triple calendars, some chronographs, and generally cleaner lines than were seen before on pocket watches, or wristwatches which were converted pocket watches. But in terms of what made a watch luxurious, there was a great deal of material value involved. For example, some Patek dealers in South America required specific entirely gold movements just to justify the quality of these watches as the finest watches in the world, which is interesting and certainly shows a different perspective on watchmaking. During this period also, there seemed to be a strong divide between complicated watches and time-telling watches, because as we know, the Rolex date just and the concept of just having a date on the dial hadn't really emerged at that point. Certainly one had triple calendars, one had complicated pieces, even minute repeaters and watches of that nature, but one didn't have a simple date, so there was a clear division in these different formats, whether you were going for absolute luxury or something more everyday, even if it was of extremely high quality. Of course, the result of all of these trends was that one had a lot of gold watches with complications, and I suppose the epitome of the finest would be Henry Graves's Patek Philippe with a minute repeater, which was a rectangular gold piece, a beautiful watch in fact, and a very complicated one too. But steel watches from this period are also collectible from the likes of Patek, partly because they've survived time much more successfully in terms of remaining the shape they originally were, but also because people tended to go for the gold option if they could afford it. Going for the steel option wasn't the common thing to do and was for a very particular and quite rare customer. The 1940s were a complicated time for the luxury wristwatch because, of course, it was a wartime period, so inevitably this wasn't a period of enormous growth with regards to new trends and new formats for watches. Of course, there was military watch production, but that falls well clear of the luxury watch industry. despite these today being classed as highly collectible watches. The luxury watches of the time still were very much concerned with the concept of adding complication, as seen with the 1518 Patek Philippe, which added the perpetual calendar chronograph to the world. And in fact, no other brand produced something similar for several decades afterwards, which just shows what an incredible step it was. But during this period, watches very much moved to a circular format rather than the previously seen square watches, which were the norm beforehand. So it was a different format, different time, but the 50s were a time when one saw a really new trend in a much more modern way. And I mean this by the fact that this era was all about the new. The war had ended, the US was enjoying a period of wealth and prosperity, and around the world the design of watches was influenced by this change. But ignoring the mechanical side of watches, which remained traditional and still very much had the interest of producing the best quality movement possible, I feel that what defined luxury watches during this period boils down to two things: the new aspects of life which people were enjoying, and the new aspects of life which people expected to take place. So in terms of what was already happening, there was a growing office culture, so one had a lot of elegant dress watches being produced, but still with rather strange at times, but also often very experimental designs with stepped bezels, new angular forms, and also very bright cases. Whether one saw a steel case or a gold case, they were highly visible during this period. One also saw new complications emerge, although these weren't regarded as luxurious at the time, if they weren't associated with something luxurious. So those early dive watches like the Rolex Submariner were tools during this time because it was very much a technical need for a watch for subaquatic exploration. However, for things like the Rolex GMT Master, there was a luxurious cachet to that because it was a new means of travel, something very glamorous. And so it was the glamour of this era and the way watches linked to it which defined what they were, as was seen with watches like the Rolex Day-Date as well, introducing a new complication to people for something new and something forward-looking. Luxury in the 60s followed a similar sort of direction to the 50s, albeit with a design which, due to the changing times, was a little bit more restrained, and I think to the modern eye is a bit more appealing on the whole in terms of looking across the breadth of the market. Inevitably there are some beautiful things from both periods, but I think the 60s have developed a certain image for watches and what they represented, because there were some highly accurate watches produced during this period, because there was an emphasis again on the quality of the watchmaking. But the 70s were perhaps the most interesting time, where the traditional ideas of quality and materials started to slide. Of course, there were quartz watches at this stage, which redefined what accurate timekeeping was. But aside from that, what was more important here was the fact that watches required new designs to remain relevant in terms of being luxury watches and to be regarded as something impressive. So one saw very experimental designs moving with the times, and so people no longer looked necessarily for mechanical engineering for this demonstration of luxury. And this changed very swiftly by the 80s, when there was a revival in the enjoyment of classical watchmaking, which still exists to this day, and is still a key defining factor to what we would regard as a luxury watch, which is interesting really, an 80s concept, and 80s advertising is still so relevant today. What's interesting is that because during the 80s you had a period of mechanical revival in terms of people becoming interested in mechanical movements, as well as a time when there was an enormous amount of money being thrown around with the sort of stockbroking culture of that time, so there became a real interest in two-tone gold, or as much gold as you could get onto a mechanical watch as possible by the end of the 80s, which is quite an interesting one, and one saw that in sports watches too, in a greater concentration than seen previously, when sports watches were usually seen in steel, but then one saw more and more in two-tone or solid gold. But by the 90s, this interest in mechanical movement seemed to have trickled down into more mundane, I say that quote-unquote, movements, like for example the Omega Seamaster 300M, I think is the icon of the 90s. It's a watch which combined this new interest in mechanical movements, of course available also in quartz, but it combined that with new lines for the 90s, in which a sports watch could be attractive, and I think changed the way people looked at these things. Of course in the 80s sports watches were starting to become appealing, but by the 90s they were appealing, and as the 2000s started, watches started to grow larger. And so by about 2010, the average size of a man's watch was significantly greater than seen 20 years prior, and that was seen as a luxurious element to a watch, partly because of new advertising campaigns aiming at a different demographic, but also a push for modernity, with brands like Rolex adding ceramic bezels to their watches, and Omega following suit just a few years later, with the earliest dive watches to be mass-produced and mass-owned with ceramic bezels. But this brings me neatly to the present day, and the last decade has been a very, very interesting time for watches. And as far as I'm concerned, I think it's been the greatest change in the watch world since, well, in the 1980s, I reckon. Because it's been a time when there's been a completely new perspective on what makes a good watch. Because nowadays, and of course starting before 2010, but really reaching maturity in 2010, there was a very specifications-driven public image of watches. Certainly the vast majority of us know to look for solid end links on watches, and these were things which people just didn't think about in the past because there was no reason to. And the funny thing is there are a lot of hollow end links which on a vintage watch people praise when nowadays we simply expect things to be more solid. And this means that modern watches are, it's fair to say, better quality, where these kinds of things like the bracelet are concerned, where the quality of the crowns are concerned, even where the quality of the hands are concerned. For the average watch, for the average person, we see really quite staggering quality from watch brands. But speaking purely about the luxury market, there is of course the in-house trend, where now the vast majority of brands wanting to make an entrance into the luxury industry have to make their own movement, or at least have a movement which is different to the industry standards out there. Of course, this has been played with by a lot of brands because a lot of movements are co-designed within a larger group, or indeed these movements have simply been modified from their original format and rebranded. But nonetheless, these in-house movements or different movements are symptomatic of an industry which wants something different. They want to buy a watch and be able to enjoy the mechanical side too, as a part of the luxury. And in this way, the experience has been important. The heritage of a brand has become extremely important. A brand new watch with great specifications will be appealing, but one which can say that it's been family produced for decades, it tends to do better. People like the story, they like the drama to the way watches have unfolded as something which we attach emotions to and memories to, which is an interesting side to this industry. But the way this has manifested itself is that even the most modern of watches today often include vintage touches from the past, to show this heritage. I mean, let's look at Tudor, for example. Now, of course, Tudor's most popular watch is the Black Bay. You could say largely because it's about half of their range, possibly even more actually with all of the offshoot models. But it's their most popular model yet with the Pelagos, which comes in at a slightly higher price range and is this titanium dive watch, but of a very modern format, still has the same design cues, with the tall case sides, the coin edge bezel, the snowflake hands. It still takes these vintage elements, because heritage is so important now today to the consumer as a component of a luxury watch. Now, of course, some brands have taken this more to heart than others. Omega has done an extremely good job of recreating some of their older pieces, and certainly designs from the past have been cherry-picked and elevated. For example, the Audemars Piguet Royal Oak and Patek Philippe Nautilus are going through an incredible time at the moment, seemingly because they slot into a culture, partly of the Instagram side of luxury watches, which I think is very interesting, but also into this part where just as some people enjoy smaller watches now, which is something I'll come to in a moment, there is still an element of enjoying larger watches but wanting the best quality, and so these watches fall into that category as sports watches but produced to the standards of the finest of dress watches, which is an interesting point, which makes them so desirable, especially in steel. And steel has become a luxury material just as much as gold is, because this solid side to watches, which was so important before the 70s, no longer really exists. Of course, people will pay more for the material, but it's not necessarily the case. It's not a necessity. Then we have an interesting contrast, which is the certain disconnect, which I think always exists in any sort of enthusiast community, between what is generally accepted to be a luxury watch, where the size of the watch doesn't seem to have quite such a bearing, where for an enthusiast the size of the watch is extremely important. And because of the number of people who've become interested in watches over the past 15 years or so, one does have to consider almost two luxury markets. There's the sort of luxury market for, say, one of the top-of-the-range Longines, which has a very vintage look and is judged upon the fact that it has a column wheel and a really clever movement, which is a throwback to the past, and a very clever recreation of something which we love in the history of Longines, and the average luxury watch, which has a very different function, and that's not a better or worse function, but it's simply not the same function as what an enthusiast would love. And one clear demonstration here is sizing, because it's interesting to see the fact that Rado have released a larger version of their Captain Cook, which was a relatively diminutive 37mm dive watch, albeit with limited water resistance, but even so, its concept was a vintage-looking 37mm dive watch, which they've enlarged to well over 40mm to 42mm, which demonstrates that there is a trend for smaller watches which has developed over the past 10 years, which denotes a certain taste in the world of luxury watches amongst enthusiasts, but actually doesn't actually equate itself to luxury if you look at the wider market for luxury watches. But to add a final touch to these various things which make up what a luxury watch is, in my opinion, today, which are factors including in-house movements or interesting movements, which are usually mechanical, this sense of heritage, as well as a look at the past sometimes, and sizing. One aspect which does need to be raised is the fact there is an emphasis on specifications these days. Of course, there have always been some factors with mechanical watches or luxury watches in general, such as the presence of brand ambassadors. I don't think this is anything new. Sure, there's the influencer trend which has grown, but it's just another form of what's existed before in terms of sales. What is new, though, is the major emphasis on specifications. Because these days, whether you're an extremely careful enthusiast and lover of a certain particular type of watch, or someone who just wants to buy a nice watch, you're given an enormous amount of information by journalists, but also by brands themselves, which are much more open about things like the beat rate of a watch, or the power reserve, and these things are becoming more and more important. And so a sense of important and good and high-level specifications are becoming more and more important as there's a more educated client base for watches, and luxury watches in particular. So this is an aspect which I think will continue forwards into the future, and is certainly an interesting aspect to look at as a factor in what a luxury watch is. And I'll pause for a moment before I talk about the future of luxury watches, because I'd like to ask anyone watching this as a video or listening to this to leave a comment down below about what you think defines a luxury watch today, or what the factors you think are which define luxury today. But the future is perhaps the most interesting time for luxury watches in terms of what we would define them as. And of course this is speculation, but from what we know from today's watches and from what is popular today, certainly supply and demand will play a role. Inevitably it already does, and it always has. And we've seen this with watches like the Patek Philippe Nautilus, with the whole of Rolex's steel sports range, where the resale prices are so enormous and so inflated as a result of enormous demand and relatively limited supply, which is of course artificially controlled, but is nonetheless there. So that's one aspect which will no doubt continue, but I think that one aspect which may be interesting to discuss is an increasing appreciation for the true rarity of small brands' watches. And I say this because I don't think even the brands producing these watches know really how difficult it is to produce them for a price. And this might not make sense immediately, but what I mean is that there are a lot of brands with, say, 20 or 30 employees, or fewer, and they charge a price which, quite frankly, for what they're offering, is astounding. Because even though they may not produce the in-house movement which other brands do produce, everything they produce is bespoke for their watches, yet they're producing far fewer watches, and they have a lot of watches to produce in terms of the growing demand for them. And a lot of brands are going to disappear over the next few years because of this imbalance in the prices they're charging and the reality of how difficult it is to produce very few watches. Despite enormous demand, this creates long waiting lists. And I think that this may well develop an appreciation for these smaller brands operating for a reasonable price, which may well be viewed as luxurious. Like, for example, Zinn have gone through an interesting few years where they have enormous waiting lists for their watches. And I don't know whether this brand will be able to cope without a price increase and a recognition that their watches are more valuable because of their rarity in production. One other aspect to look at is forward-looking design. Now, there's been a strong trend towards vintage, or the classic looks of older watches over the past few years, and this is all well and good, but it has meant that there's been a stagnation in terms of new designs from a lot of brands. So I think that we may well see brand new, crisp, impressive designs marking a new beginning, because whilst watch enthusiasts love vintage remakes, there is quite clear proof they're not as popular amongst the vast majority of people, which makes perfect sense. You want a modern, crisp, interesting design, and so I think brands producing these will enjoy a certain position in the future as a result of the need to move away from the trends which currently exist, and the fact that a lot of brands haven't designed anything completely and radically new in a few years because of this vintage trend. Perhaps most importantly, though, I think one aspect which is only going to grow in this industry, and which has been born of the vintage trend, is the idea of storytelling. Because I think this is crucial in terms of understanding what a watch means, to understand its background, to understand its story. And this is, I think, why the industry is becoming more community-driven, because it is a social thing rather than necessarily a symbol of a sort of status symbol. I think there are still status symbols in this industry, but the story is what often convinces people to make the purchase. So I think we'll see more and more of this, which I think is a good thing for the industry, because it gives more life to watches, as more than just metal and clockwork. They become something a bit more meaningful, which I think is very interesting, and certainly means a lot more when you put it into the context of what they are in our lives, as a little companion you have on your wrist. But do remember to tell me in the comments down below what you thought of this podcast, because it is very interesting to consider the future, the past and the present, and as we change era as well as we enter a new decade, it's all the more pertinent to consider what luxury is really, as indeed a lot of people in my position spend their time talking about luxury watches, but one does sometimes have to step back and ask what actually is a luxury watch and why do we define it thus. But thank you very much for listening, and remember to like, share and subscribe if you're on YouTube, and also leave a comment if you're listening to it on the Watch Chronicler website. So thank you very much for listening. This is Armand from WatchChronicler.com, out.